It was Christmas Eve, and I was in the kitchen getting everything ready for our family dinner. The house was filled with the usual holiday buzz. My kids were watching Christmas movies in the living room, and my husband was setting the table. I had been looking forward to this moment for weeks, planning the perfect menu to make everyone happy. I started working on the main attraction, the turkey. I had bought it just 2 days ago from Wilson's, the grocery store down the street that everyone in our neighborhood trusts. As I unwrapped it, I noticed it felt a bit off. The packaging looked fine, but something about the texture didn't seem quite right. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just because it had been in the fridge for a couple of days. I began preparing it like I always do, washing it thoroughly and patting it dry. That's when I caught a whiff of something unusual. At first, I thought it might be coming from the garbage disposal. You know how those things can get funky sometimes. I ran it for a bit, but the smell persisted. As I continued working on the turkey, the odor seemed to get stronger. It wasn't overwhelming, just wrong. I couldn't quite place it, but it definitely wasn't the fresh, clean smell you'd expect from poultry. I started to feel a bit uneasy, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, this was an important meal and I wanted everything to be perfect. I seasoned the turkey and got it ready for the oven. The whole time, that nagging smell kept bothering me. I even asked my husband to come and check, but he said he couldn't smell anything unusual. Maybe it was just my nerves getting the best of me. Once the turkey was in the oven, I tried to focus on the other dishes. I made the stuffing, prepared the green bean casserole, and whipped up some mashed potatoes. All the while, I kept glancing at the oven, half expecting something to go wrong. After a few hours, it was time to take the turkey out. The smell that hit me when I opened the oven door was intense. It wasn't the rich, savory aroma you'd expect from a roasted turkey. Instead, it was sour and slightly sweet, reminding me of the time we forgot about a pack of ground beef in the back of the fridge during a summer heat wave. I pulled the turkey out, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The skin looked golden brown, just like it should, but as I set it on the counter, I noticed that parts of it seemed softer than they should be. My hands were shaking a bit as I picked up the carving knife. I told myself I was being silly. After all, I'd prepared dozens of turkeys before without any issues. But as soon as the knife pierced the skin, I knew something was terribly wrong. The inside of the turkey was a nightmare. Instead of firm white meat, I saw a grayish, slimy mass. And then, movement. Tiny white shapes wriggling in the flesh. Maggots. Dozens, maybe hundreds of them, squirming through what should have been our Christmas dinner. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a chair. The carving knife clattered to the floor, and I had to clap a hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. The smell that had been bothering me all afternoon suddenly made horrifying sense. As I stood there, frozen in shock, I could hear my family in the dining room. My kids were laughing about something, and I could hear the clink of glasses as my husband poured drinks. They were all waiting eagerly for the meal I'd promised them, the perfect Christmas dinner that was now crawling with maggots on our kitchen counter. I felt sick to my stomach. How could this have happened? The turkey was fresh. I'd bought it just 2 days ago. It had been refrigerated the whole time. There was no way it could have gone bad so quickly, and yet the evidence was right there in front of me, impossibly real and utterly disgusting. For a moment, I considered trying to salvage the situation. Maybe I could quickly whip up something else. But I knew there was no way I could serve anything from this kitchen now. The thought of any food touching the surfaces where that rotten, infested turkey had been made me want to gag. I could hear my oldest calling from the dining room, asking if everything was okay. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could I explain this? How could I tell them that our Christmas dinner, the meal we'd all been looking forward to, was not just ruined, but horrifyingly, disgustingly spoiled? The reality of the situation started to sink in. This wasn't just about a ruined meal. What if I hadn't noticed? What if we had eaten that turkey? The thought sent a wave of nausea through me. We could have all gotten seriously ill. And even though we hadn't, the mere idea of what could have happened was terrifying. I knew I had to tell them. I couldn't just stand in the kitchen forever staring at this revolting scene. But as I took a deep breath and prepared to face my family, all I could think about was how I was about to ruin Christmas. Not just the dinner, but the whole day. Maybe even future Christmases. How could we not remember this every year? With shaking hands, I picked up a dish towel to wipe my face. I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflection of the microwave door. I looked pale and shaken. There was no way I could hide this from them. I took one last look at the turkey on the counter, still not quite believing what I was seeing. The maggots continued their grotesque dance through the rotten flesh, oblivious to the havoc they were wreaking on our holiday. Taking a deep breath, I stepped towards the dining room. I could hear the happy chatter of my family, the sound of Christmas music playing softly in the background. In just a few seconds, I was going to change all of that. I was going to have to tell them that not only was there no dinner, but that we'd narrowly avoided a potential health disaster. Hey there. Hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. And now. Last year, our company's Christmas party was at the office. You know, one of those potluck things where everyone brings something. I'd been looking forward to it all week, a chance to relax a bit with coworkers and enjoy some good food before the holidays. When I got there, the conference room was all decked out with tinsel and lights. People were milling around, chatting and laughing. The long table in the middle was loaded with all kinds of dishes, casseroles, dips, sandwiches, you name it. And at the end, there was this big platter of homemade cookies. I grabbed a paper plate and started making my way down the table, picking up a little of this and that. When I got to the cookies, I noticed how nice they looked, all decorated with red and green icing, perfect for Christmas. I took a couple and found a spot to stand near some of my team members. We were talking about plans for the holidays when I decided to try one of the cookies. I bit into it, expecting that sweet, sugary taste. But something was off. There was this weird crunch, different from the normal cookie texture. Before I could even process what was happening, I felt this sharp pain in my mouth. I stopped mid-sentence, confused. My coworkers looked at me, probably wondering why I'd suddenly gone quiet. I put my hand to my mouth, not sure what was going on. That's when I tasted it. Blood. My mouth was filling with it, mixing with the cookie I'd been chewing. I must have looked pretty freaked out because one of my coworkers asked if I was okay. I couldn't really answer. I was too focused on trying to figure out what was in my mouth. I managed to spit what was left of the cookie into a napkin, and that's when I saw it. A small, jagged piece of what looked like glass tinged with my blood. For a second, I just stared at it, not quite believing what I was seeing. How could there be glass in a cookie? I looked back at the platter, suddenly very aware that I'd taken 2 cookies. The second one was still on my plate, looking harmless. By this point, a small group had formed around me. Someone brought me a cup of water, and I rinsed my mouth out, spitting into the trash can. The taste of blood was overwhelming, and I could feel a cut on the inside of my cheek where the glass had sliced it. One of the HR managers came over, asking what had happened. I showed her the piece of glass and pointed to the cookie platter. She immediately went into crisis mode, asking everyone to stop eating and step away from the food table. There was this weird moment where the party kind of split in two. Half the room hadn't noticed anything was wrong and was still chatting and enjoying themselves. The other half was clustered around me and the cookie platter, a bubble of tension in the otherwise festive room. Someone, I think it was one of the IT guys, started carefully breaking apart the cookies on the platter. And sure enough, there were more pieces of glass. Some were bigger than what I'd bitten into, and I remember thinking how lucky I was that I hadn't swallowed any. The HR manager was asking who had brought the cookies. There was this awkward silence, and then one of the women from accounting raised her hand. She looked mortified. When the HR manager asked her about the glass, she went pale. She started explaining, her voice shaky, that she'd been baking the cookies at home the night before. Apparently, she'd accidentally knocked a glass mixing bowl off the counter while she was working. She'd cleaned up the pieces she could see, but she never imagined some might have fallen into the cookie dough. As she was talking, I could see people around the room checking their plates, their mouths. A few were heading to the trash cans to spit out what they were eating. The festive atmosphere had completely evaporated, replaced by this weird mix of fear and disbelief. The HR manager was trying to keep everyone calm, but you could tell she was struggling to handle the situation. She asked if anyone else had eaten the cookies or felt anything unusual in their mouth. A couple of people raised their hands, but thankfully, no one else had actually bitten into any glass. I was still standing there, holding the napkin with the bloody piece of glass, feeling a bit in shock. My mouth was really starting to hurt now that the initial surprise had worn off. Someone suggested I should probably go to the emergency room to get checked out, just in case there were any smaller pieces I hadn't noticed. The woman who'd brought the cookies came over to me, looking like she was about to cry. She kept apologizing over and over. I didn't know what to say. I mean, I knew she hadn't done it on purpose, but at the same time I had a mouthful of cuts and who knows what other damage. The party was pretty much over at that point. People were throwing away their food, not trusting anything on the table anymore. A few of my closer coworkers stuck around, offering to drive me to the hospital. The HR manager was on the phone, I guess talking to the higher-ups about what had happened. As we were getting ready to leave, I overheard someone say they should check the other food too, just in case. That's when it really hit me how bad this could have been. What if there had been glass in other dishes? What if I had swallowed it instead of noticing it in my mouth? The drive to the hospital was surreal. Here I was, heading to the ER on the day of the office Christmas party, all because of a cookie. My coworker who was driving kept glancing over at me, asking if I was okay. I didn't know how to answer. Physically, aside from the cuts in my mouth, I felt fine. But I couldn't shake this feeling of unease. Sitting in the waiting room, still in my work clothes, a bit of tinsel stuck to my shoe, I couldn't help but think about how quickly things had gone from normal to nightmare. One minute I was enjoying a Christmas cookie, the next I was waiting to have my mouth examined for shards of glass. A nurse called my name, and as I stood up to follow her, I caught a glimpse of myself in a reflection. There was a smear of blood on my lower lip, a stark contrast to the cheerful red and green of my Christmas sweater. In that moment, the reality of what had happened really sank in. This wasn't just a weird story to tell later. This was dangerous, potentially seriously harmful. I was so excited to host Christmas dinner for the first time. My sister and her family had always done it, but this year they were traveling, so I volunteered. I wanted everything to be perfect. I spent weeks planning the menu, decorating the house, and making sure I had all the right ingredients. On Christmas Day, I was up early, getting everything ready. The turkey was in the oven, filling the house with that amazing holiday smell. I was chopping vegetables for the sides, checking my list every few minutes to make sure I wasn't forgetting anything. I wanted to impress everyone, especially my parents. They'd always praised my sister's cooking, and I was determined to show them I could do just as well. One of the things I was most excited about was the homemade eggnog. I'd found this recipe online that was supposed to be amazing. It had all these spices and flavors that I thought would really make it special. I'd never made eggnog before, but the recipe seemed simple enough. As I was mixing it up, I noticed it called for almond extract. I hesitated for a second because I knew my nephew had some allergies, but I couldn't remember exactly what. I figured it was probably fine. After all, it was just a little extract, not actual nuts. Plus, the recipe said it was what made the eggnog taste so good. I wanted everything to be perfect, so I added it in. The afternoon went by in a blur of cooking and last-minute cleaning. Before I knew it, the doorbell was ringing. My parents arrived first, then my brother and his wife. My sister's family was the last to arrive. My sister-in-law, my nephew, and my niece. They all came in, shaking off the cold, carrying gifts and side dishes. Everyone was in such a good mood, laughing and chatting. My nephew, who's about 12, was excited to show me the new video game he'd gotten for Christmas. I was trying to listen while also keeping an eye on the kitchen, making sure nothing was burning. Finally, everything was ready. We all gathered around the table, admiring the spread. I was so proud of how it all looked. The turkey was golden brown, the sides were steaming, and everything smelled delicious. Before we sat down to eat, I decided to serve the eggnog. I poured it into these fancy glasses I'd bought specially for the occasion. Everyone took one, complimenting how good it looked. My nephew seemed especially excited. He'd never had eggnog before. I watched as he took a big gulp, waiting to see his reaction. At first, everything seemed fine. We all started to eat, passing dishes around the table. I was basking in the compliments about the food. But then I noticed my nephew wasn't eating. He was just sitting there looking uncomfortable. I asked if he was okay and he nodded, but I could tell something was off. He took another sip of the eggnog, and that's when things started to go wrong. He coughed a little, then a little more. At first I thought maybe it had just gone down the wrong way, but the coughing didn't stop. It got worse, and I could see he was struggling to catch his breath. His face was turning red and he was clutching at his throat. That's when I saw the panic in my sister-in-law's eyes. She jumped up, knocking over her chair, and rushed to my nephew's side. Everything happened so fast after that. My sister-in-law was asking my nephew something, her voice high and panicked. I caught the words EpiPen and car, and suddenly my brother was running out the front door. I stood there, not understanding what was happening. My nephew's coughing had turned into a horrible wheezing sound. He was gasping for air, his eyes wide with fear. My sister-in-law was trying to keep him calm, but I could see she was terrified. Someone shouted to call 911. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial the numbers. As I was talking to the operator, trying to explain what was happening, it suddenly hit me. The almond extract in the eggnog. My nephew was allergic to nuts. How could I have forgotten that? The guilt and horror washed over me as I watched my nephew struggle to breathe. His lips were turning blue. My brother burst back in with the EpiPen, and my sister-in-law grabbed it from him. She jabbed it into my nephew's thigh, but it didn't seem to be helping. The operator was still on the phone telling me the ambulance was on its way. She was asking me questions about my nephew's condition, but I could barely focus. All I could see was his face, growing paler by the second, his chest heaving as he fought for each breath. The sound of sirens was the biggest relief I'd ever felt. Paramedics rushed in, pushing past us to get to my nephew. They worked quickly, asking questions and hooking him up to some kind of machine. I heard words like anaphylaxis and intubation, but it all felt like a blur. As they were preparing to take him to the hospital, one of the paramedics asked what had caused the reaction. My sister-in-law mentioned the eggnog, and I had to admit what I'd done. The look on her face when I said almond extract. I'll never forget it. It was a mixture of disbelief, anger, and fear. They rushed my nephew out on a stretcher, my sister-in-law and brother going with them. The rest of us were left standing in the wreckage of what was supposed to be a perfect Christmas dinner. The table was still set, food going cold, the cheerful decorations now seeming horribly out of place. My parents started cleaning up silently. My niece was crying quietly in the corner, and I just stood there, the half-empty glass of eggnog still in my hand, unable to believe what had just happened. The guilt was overwhelming. How could I have been so careless? I knew about his allergy, but I'd been so focused on making everything perfect that I hadn't stopped to think. One small mistake, one moment of forgetfulness, and now my nephew was fighting for his life. I kept replaying everything in my mind. The moment I added the almond extract to the eggnog, the look on my nephew's face when he took that first sip, the sound of his desperate attempts to breathe. It all seemed like a nightmare, but the dirty dishes and overturned chairs were stark reminders that it was all too real. As we waited for news, the house felt suffocating. The Christmas tree lights blinked cheerfully, a jarring contrast to the somber mood. I couldn't bear to look at the other family members. I felt like I'd ruined everything. Not just dinner, but Christmas, and possibly so much more. Time seemed to crawl by. Every time a car passed outside, we all tensed up, hoping it was my brother returning with news. But the minutes ticked by with no word. The waiting was excruciating. Every scenario ran through my head. What if the ambulance hadn't gotten there in time? What if the epinephrine wasn't enough? The what-ifs were endless and terrifying. Finally, after what felt like hours, my phone rang. It was my brother. We all held our breath as I answered. His voice sounded tired but relieved. My nephew was going to be okay. They'd managed to get his breathing under control, and he was responding well to treatment. He'd have to stay in the hospital overnight for observation, but the doctors were optimistic. The relief in the room was palpable, but it was mixed with a lingering tension. Yes, my nephew was going to be all right, but we'd come so close to tragedy, and it was all because of a simple mistake I'd made. Last Christmas, I was so excited to host dinner for my family. We just moved into a bigger house and I wanted to show off our new kitchen. I'd spent weeks planning everything, right down to the fancy new electric carving knife I'd bought specially for the occasion. It was supposed to make carving the ham a breeze. The day started off great. The house smelled amazing, a mix of cinnamon, pine from the tree, and that unmistakable aroma of ham slowly cooking in the oven. My kids were running around, all hyped up on holiday excitement, and my wife was putting the finishing touches on the table decorations. When it was time to carve the ham, I felt like the star of the show. Everyone gathered around the table, oohing and aahing over how good everything looked. I plugged in the new electric knife, feeling pretty proud of myself. The blade started humming, and I remember thinking how easy this was going to be. The first few slices went smoothly. The knife cut through the ham like it was butter, and I was already imagining how impressed everyone would be with these perfect, thin slices. But then, something felt off. The knife started vibrating differently, not as smooth as before. I didn't think much of it at first, just assumed it was hitting a tougher part of the meat. I pressed a little harder, trying to get through what I thought was just a stubborn spot. That's when things went horribly wrong. In a split second, the blade seemed to jump. I felt a sharp pain in my hand, but it didn't register right away what had happened. It was the look on my wife's face that clued me in first. Her eyes went wide, and she let out this gasp that I'll never forget. I looked down, and that's when I saw it. Blood. So much blood. It was pouring out of my hand, spreading across the white tablecloth, mixing with the gravy, splattering onto the slices of ham I'd just cut. The pain hit me then, intense and searing. I dropped the knife, but it was still running, clattering across the table, spraying blood everywhere. My brain couldn't process what was happening. I just stood there, watching my hand pump out blood like some kind of grotesque fountain. My wife snapped into action first. She grabbed a bunch of napkins and pressed them against my hand. The white cloth turned red almost instantly. I remember feeling dizzy, the room starting to spin a little. The kids were screaming now, but it sounded distant, like it was coming from another room. I tried to step back from the table, but my legs felt wobbly. I bumped into my chair and nearly fell. My wife was yelling something about calling an ambulance, but all I could focus on was the blood. It was everywhere. On the food, the tablecloth, my clothes. The metallic smell of it mixed with the ham and cranberry sauce in a way that made my stomach turn. My oldest kid, bless him, he tried to help. He ran to get more napkins, but he slipped on some blood that had dripped onto the floor. He didn't fall, but the look of horror on his face when he realized what he'd slipped in, that's an image that's burned into my memory. The room was chaos. My wife was on the phone, her voice shaky as she tried to explain what happened. The younger kids were crying, huddled together in the corner of the dining room. And me, I just stood there holding my hand, watching as more and more blood seeped through the napkins. I started feeling lightheaded. The pain was intense, throbbing with each heartbeat. I could see the cut now, deep and jagged across my palm. It looked wrong, like something out of a horror movie, not something that should be on my own hand. The beautiful Christmas table was ruined. The carefully arranged plates of food were splattered with blood. The Christmas crackers we were supposed to pull later were soaked through, their bright colors now stained a dark red. Even the little Santa figurine we put in the center of the table hadn't escaped. He was splashed with blood, his jolly expression now seeming grotesquely out of place. I don't know how long I stood there, but I remember suddenly feeling very cold. My shirt was sticking to me, wet with sweat and blood. I could hear sirens in the distance growing louder. Part of me felt relieved, but another part was embarrassed. What would the neighbors think seeing an ambulance pull up on Christmas Day? As the sirens got closer, I looked at my family. My wife's face was pale, her hands shaking as she held the phone. The kids were still crying, their eyes wide with fear. And suddenly, all I could think about was how I'd ruined Christmas. All the planning, all the excitement, and now this. The pain in my hand was getting worse, a deep, throbbing ache that seemed to pulse through my entire arm. I tried to flex my fingers and nearly passed out from the pain. That's when I realized how serious this might be. What if I'd severed tendons? Would I be able to use my hand again? I could hear someone pounding on the front door now. My wife ran to answer it, leaving me alone in the dining room with the kids. I wanted to say something to them, to reassure them, but I couldn't find the words. What could I possibly say to make this okay? The paramedics rushed in, their voices loud and authoritative in our usually quiet home. They started asking me questions, but I was having trouble focusing. Everything seemed to be happening in slow motion. I watched as one of them carefully unwrapped the blood-soaked napkins from my hand, wincing at what he saw. They talked about stitches, about possible tendon damage. One of them mentioned something about microsurgery, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This was supposed to be a happy day, a day for family and celebration. Instead, I was about to take a ride in an ambulance. As they prepared to move me, I caught one last look at the dining room. The beautiful table my wife had spent hours setting was in shambles. Blood-soaked napkins were scattered everywhere. The ham, which was supposed to be the centerpiece of our meal, sat forgotten, partially carved and spattered with my blood. The kids were huddled with my wife now, watching with wide, scared eyes as the paramedics helped me onto a stretcher. I wanted to tell them it would be okay, that this wasn't how our Christmas was supposed to go. But before I could say anything, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The last thing I remember is being wheeled out of the house. We were at my in-laws' place for Christmas dinner. It's this annual thing we do, you know? Always at their house because my mother-in-law insists on cooking everything herself. She's got this huge kitchen, and she loves showing it off. So we get there, and the house is all decked out in Christmas decorations. Lights everywhere, this massive tree in the corner of the living room, and the smell of food cooking just hits you as soon as you walk in. My wife's siblings are already there with their kids, and everyone's in that festive mood, laughing and catching up. My mother-in-law is still bustling around in the kitchen, putting the finishing touches on everything. She's always been a bit of a perfectionist when it comes to cooking, especially on Christmas. We offer to help, but she shoos us away, saying she's got it all under control. Finally, we all sit down at this big dining table. It's loaded with food: turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce, and of course the stuffing. My mother-in-law's stuffing is kind of famous in the family. She's got this secret recipe that she refuses to share with anyone. We start passing the dishes around, everyone piling their plates high. The kids are excited, barely sitting still in their chairs. My father-in-law carves the turkey, and we all dig in. At first, everything's great. The food is delicious, as always. We're all chatting, sharing stories about the past year and enjoying the meal. I'm about halfway through my plate when I take a big forkful of stuffing. It's always been my favorite part of the meal. I'm chewing away, not really paying attention, when suddenly I feel something hard in my mouth. At first I think maybe it's just a bit of overcooked stuffing, or maybe a small piece of turkey bone that got mixed in somehow. But as I move it around with my tongue, I realize it's too hard to be either of those things. It's smooth on one side, but rough and jagged on the other. I try to discreetly spit it into my napkin, not wanting to make a scene. When I look down at it, my stomach does this weird flip. It's a tooth. Or at least part of a tooth. It's this off-white color, with what looks like a bit of metal attached to it. For a second, I just stare at it, not really processing what I'm seeing. I run my tongue over my own teeth, half convinced I must have somehow broken one of mine without noticing. But all my teeth are intact. I look up, and I guess the expression on my face must have been pretty obvious because my wife notices something's wrong. She leans over and whispers, asking if I'm okay. I don't know what to say. I mean, how do you tell someone you just found a tooth in your food? I show her the napkin and her eyes go wide. She looks as confused as I feel. By now, a couple of other people at the table have noticed that something's up. The conversation starts to die down, and people are looking at us curiously. My father-in-law asks if everything's all right, and I just don't know how to respond. I mean, what do you say in this situation? Hey, I just found a tooth in the stuffing. Anyone missing one? It sounds ridiculous even in my head, but I know I have to say something. So, as calmly as I can, I explain what I found. At first, there's this moment of stunned silence. Then everyone starts talking at once. Some people look disgusted. Others are in disbelief. My sister-in-law actually pushes her plate away like the food suddenly turned toxic. The kids, of course, think it's the coolest thing ever. My nephew wants to see the tooth, and his mother is trying to shush him while looking like she might be sick. My wife is examining the tooth more closely now, and she's the one who notices the metal part. That's when it clicks. She looks at her mother and asks, "Mom, isn't this your crown? The one you got last month?" And my mother-in-law, who's been uncharacteristically quiet this whole time, suddenly goes pale. She puts her hand to her mouth, feeling around with her tongue, and her eyes go wide. The look on her face is a mix of horror and embarrassment. She starts apologizing profusely, explaining that she'd felt the crown come loose earlier while she was tasting the stuffing, but she thought she'd swallowed it. She hadn't even realized it had fallen out into the food. Now, you'd think this would be the end of it, right? We've solved the mystery of the tooth, but no, things just get more awkward from here. My father-in-law starts asking how she could not notice losing a whole tooth. My sister-in-law is going on about food safety and contamination. And my brother-in-law, always the joker, makes some comment about how we're lucky it wasn't something worse, like a finger. That comment doesn't go over well. My mother-in-law bursts into tears, which sets off the younger kids. They don't really understand what's happening, but they know Grandma is upset, so they start crying too. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there, still holding this tooth crown thing in my napkin, not sure what to do with it. Do I give it back to my mother-in-law? Do I keep it as some sort of weird Christmas souvenir? The whole situation feels surreal. My wife is trying to calm her mother down, assuring her that it was just an accident and that no one blames her. But you can see on everyone's faces that the meal is pretty much ruined. No one's eating anymore. The food that looked so appetizing just minutes ago now seems kind of revolting. My father-in-law suggests we just clear the table and maybe order some pizzas instead. But that just makes my mother-in-law cry harder. All her hard work, the hours she spent preparing this meal, and now it's all going to waste. The next few minutes are chaos. People are getting up from the table, some taking their plates to the kitchen, others just leaving them where they are. The kids are being ushered out of the dining room by their parents. My mother-in-law is still at the table, sobbing into her hands. I'm still sitting there feeling weirdly responsible for this whole mess. If I hadn't bitten down on that crown, if I'd just swallowed it without noticing, we'd all still be enjoying our dinner. But then I think about how much worse it could have been. What if someone had choked on it? As people are milling around, not sure what to do next, I overhear my sister-in-law on the phone, presumably canceling their plans to visit her husband's family for dessert. My brother-in-law is in the kitchen, loudly opening and closing cupboards, probably looking for something to eat that isn't homemade. My wife is still with her mother, arm around her shoulders, talking to her quietly. I catch fragments of their conversation, something about a dentist and whether the crown can be reattached. It's such a mundane concern in the middle of this bizarre situation. The kids have moved on already, as kids do. I can hear them in the living room arguing over which Christmas movie to watch. It's like they've already forgotten about the drama at the dinner table. Part of me envies their ability to bounce back so quickly. I finally get up, still clutching my napkin with its weird contents. I head to the kitchen thinking I'll wrap it up in some foil or something. As I'm doing this, my father-in-law comes in. He looks at what I'm doing and just shakes his head, a mix of disbelief and amusement on his face. He pats me on the shoulder and says something about how this will be a Christmas we'll never forget. And standing there in the kitchen, wrapping up my mother-in-law's tooth in foil like some kind of grotesque leftover, I can't help but agree. This is definitely not how I imagined our family Christmas dinner would go. So there I was at my parents' house for our annual Christmas gift exchange. It's this thing we do every year, where the whole family gets together to swap presents and stuff our faces with holiday treats. The living room was packed with relatives, all crammed onto couches and chairs, some even sitting on the floor. I'd just finished handing out the gifts I'd brought. Nothing fancy, just some gift cards and a few small gadgets. My sister had given me this oversized sweater with reindeer on it, which I was now wearing to be polite. It was itchy as hell, but hey, it's Christmas, right? Anyway, I was sitting there, watching my niece unwrap her new doll, when I spotted the bowl of candy canes on the coffee table. I hadn't had one in ages, and suddenly I was craving that minty sweetness. Without really thinking about it, I reached over and grabbed one. I unwrapped it, the plastic crinkling loudly in my hands. The candy cane was cool and smooth, with those classic red and white stripes. I popped one end into my mouth, savoring that initial burst of peppermint. It was exactly how I remembered: sweet, minty, and refreshing. For a few moments, everything was fine. I was sucking on the candy cane, half listening to my uncle's story about his new lawnmower. The Christmas tree lights were twinkling in the corner, and someone had put on some cheesy holiday music in the background. It was all very normal, very Christmassy. Then, without warning, everything changed. I bit down on the candy cane, just like I'd done 100 times before. But this time, instead of the satisfying crunch I was expecting, I felt this sudden sharp pain shoot through my jaw. It was like someone had jabbed a hot needle right into my tooth. At first I thought maybe I'd just bitten down too hard. You know how sometimes you get that twinge when you eat something too cold? I figured it was something like that, so I tried to ignore it, kept on chewing. But the pain didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. I must have made some kind of noise or face because my mom looked over at me with this concerned expression. I tried to smile to show everything was fine, but the moment I moved my jaw, another wave of pain hit me. This time it was so intense that my eyes started watering. I reached up to touch my cheek, half expecting it to be swollen or something, but everything felt normal on the outside. It was all happening inside my mouth. I ran my tongue over my teeth, trying to figure out what was going on. That's when I felt it. This weird, rough spot on one of my molars. Now I'd had some dental work done a few months back. Nothing major, just a filling for a small cavity. I hadn't thought about it since, to be honest. But now, as I probed that spot with my tongue, I realized something was very wrong. The filling felt loose, like it was barely hanging on. I excused myself and hurried to the bathroom, my heart pounding. I flipped on the light and leaned in close to the mirror, opening my mouth wide. It took some maneuvering, but I finally got a good look at the problem tooth. What I saw made my stomach drop. The filling was gone, completely gone. In its place was this dark hole, jagged around the edges where the candy cane had ripped the filling clean out. I could see bits of red and white stuck in the hole, remnants of the candy cane that had fused with the filling and yanked it out. I stood there for a moment, just staring at my reflection in disbelief. How could this have happened? It was just a candy cane, for crying out loud. But as I watched, a drop of blood welled up from the hole in my tooth, and the pain kicked up another notch. I tried rinsing my mouth out with water, hoping it would help, but the moment the cold water hit that exposed nerve, it felt like someone had stuck a live wire to my tooth. I actually yelped out loud, the pain was so intense. By this point, I could hear my family outside the door, asking if I was okay. I didn't know what to tell them. I mean, how do you explain that you've just had a dental emergency because of a Christmas candy? It seemed so ridiculous, so absurd. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the bathroom. Everyone was looking at me with these worried expressions. I tried to explain what had happened, but it was hard to talk without moving my jaw too much. Every word sent little shockwaves of pain through my mouth. My dad suggested we try to find an emergency dentist, but it was Christmas night. Everything was closed. The best we could do was dig up some old painkillers from the medicine cabinet and hope they would take the edge off. But they didn't. Not really. As the night wore on, the pain just got worse and worse. It was this constant throbbing ache that seemed to radiate through my entire head. I couldn't eat anything. Even the thought of putting food in my mouth made me wince. Drinking was a challenge too. I had to use a straw, and even then, if the liquid was too hot or too cold, it was agony. The worst part was that I could feel the hole with my tongue. I knew I shouldn't keep touching it, but I couldn't help it. It was like when you have a loose tooth as a kid, and you can't stop wiggling it. Except this wasn't a loose tooth. This was a gaping hole where my filling used to be, and every time my tongue brushed against it, I was reminded of how badly I'd messed up my Christmas. The gift exchange continued around me, but I was barely aware of it. I sat in the corner of the couch, holding an ice pack to my cheek, trying not to move or speak or do anything that might trigger another wave of pain. My family kept shooting me these pitying looks, which only made me feel worse. As the night went on, the pain seemed to take on a life of its own. It pulsed in time with my heartbeat, each throb a reminder of that moment when everything went wrong. I found myself watching the clock, counting down the hours until morning when I might be able to find a dentist. I couldn't sleep. Every time I lay down, the pressure in my jaw seemed to intensify. I ended up pacing around the guest room, holding the side of my face, silently begging for the pain to stop. But it didn't. It just kept going, a relentless assault on my senses. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted, in pain, and more than a little scared. What if the damage was permanent? What if I needed a root canal? Or worse, what if I lost the tooth entirely? All because of a candy cane. A stupid Christmas candy cane. It was the day after Christmas, and I was home alone, still surrounded by all the holiday decorations. My family had left earlier that morning, heading back to their own homes, leaving behind a fridge full of leftovers. I was feeling a bit lazy and didn't want to cook anything new, so I decided to heat up some of the Christmas pudding from the night before. I went to the kitchen and opened the fridge, the cool air hitting my face as I reached for the container of pudding. It was still pretty full. We'd all been too stuffed from dinner to eat much dessert. I popped the lid off and scooped a generous portion onto a plate. The pudding looked dense and rich, studded with fruit and nuts. My mouth watered a bit just looking at it. I put the plate in the microwave, setting it for a minute. I figured that should be enough to warm it through without making it too hot. As I waited, I leaned against the counter, scrolling through my phone. I could hear the low hum of the microwave and the occasional pop as the pudding started to heat up. About halfway through, I noticed the sound changing slightly. It was getting louder, more intense. I glanced up from my phone, frowning a little. Something didn't seem quite right. The microwave was making a weird whirring noise I'd never heard before. I took a step closer, peering through the little window to see what was going on. The pudding was bubbling. Not just a little bit, but violently. It was expanding, pushing up against the sides of the plate. I reached out to stop the microwave, but before I could even touch the button, there was a loud bang. The microwave door flew open with a force I didn't think was possible. In that split second, I saw the pudding explode outward, like some kind of twisted edible firework. Then everything went dark. The pain hit me immediately. It was like nothing I'd ever felt before. My face felt like it was on fire, burning and stinging all at once. I could feel something hot and sticky dripping down my cheeks, my forehead, even into my mouth. The taste was a horrible mix of sweet pudding and something metallic. Blood, I realized with a jolt of panic. But the worst part was my eyes. They were burning, stinging so badly I couldn't even think about opening them. I tried to blink to clear whatever was in them, but it only made the pain worse. I couldn't see anything, just darkness. I stumbled backward, my hands flying up to my face instinctively. My fingers touched the sticky mess and I felt a wave of nausea. Was this my skin? Had the pudding burned me that badly? I couldn't tell, and not being able to see made everything 10 times more terrifying. I needed help. I needed to call someone, anyone. But my phone was on the counter, and I had no idea where I was in relation to it. I turned, trying to orient myself, but without my sight, everything was confusing. I took a step forward and banged my hip hard against something. The kitchen island, I thought. The pain in my hip was nothing compared to the agony in my face and eyes, but it made me realize how dangerous moving around blindly could be. I needed to be careful. to take it slow. But the panic was rising in my chest, making it hard to think rationally. I shuffled forward, my hands outstretched, trying to find something familiar. My fingers brushed against something soft, a dish towel hanging from the oven handle. I grabbed it, pressing it against my face, hoping it might help clean off some of the mess. But as soon as the fabric touched my skin, I regretted it. The pain flared up again, worse than before, and I let out a cry of pain and frustration. I needed to get out of the kitchen. I needed to find a phone or get to the front door to call for help. I turned in what I thought was the direction of the living room, taking small, shuffling steps. My foot caught on something. A rug, maybe, and I stumbled. I threw my hands out to catch myself, but instead of hitting the floor, I felt something prickly and sharp, the Christmas tree. I'd walked right into it. I tried to push myself away, but I was off balance, disoriented. I felt the tree tilt, heard the ornaments start to rattle. Then everything seemed to happen at once. The tree fell, taking me with it. I heard the crash of breaking ornaments, felt the scratch of pine needles against my arms and legs. Something heavy, probably the tree stand, landed on my foot, sending a new spike of pain through my body. I was tangled in the tree, surrounded by broken glass and who knows what else. The lights were still on. I could feel the warmth of the bulbs against my skin, but I still couldn't see anything. The darkness was absolute, terrifying. I tried to push myself up to get out from under the tree, but my hands kept slipping on broken ornaments and sticky pudding. Every movement sent new waves of pain through my face and eyes. I could feel something warm trickling down my arms, blood from where the broken glass had cut me. The panic was overwhelming now. I couldn't see. I was in pain, and I was trapped under a Christmas tree. I started yelling, screaming for help, even though I knew there was no one around to hear me. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, hoarse and desperate. I don't know how long I lay there, struggling and yelling. Time seemed to stretch and warp. My face and eyes were still burning, but now it was mixed with a deep, throbbing pain. I was shivering. Whether from shock or fear, I couldn't tell. Eventually, I managed to push enough of the tree off me to sit up. I was still surrounded by broken glass and tangled lights, but at least I wasn't pinned down anymore. I reached up to touch my face again, half expecting to feel raw, burned skin. But while it was still sticky and painful, it didn't feel as bad as I'd feared. Maybe the pudding hadn't been as hot as I thought. My eyes were still the biggest problem. I couldn't open them at all, and the pain hadn't lessened. I needed to rinse them out, to get whatever was in them out. But the idea of standing up, of trying to find my way to a sink while blind and surrounded by broken glass, was terrifying. I sat there, trying to calm my breathing, to think of what to do next. I needed to find my phone. I needed to call for help. But how could I find it when I couldn't see anything? I started patting the ground around me, careful to avoid the areas where I could feel broken glass. As I was searching, I heard a sound that made me freeze. A key in the lock, the front door opening, footsteps. Someone was here. Relief flooded through me, so intense it was almost painful. I opened my mouth to call out, to let them know where I was and that I needed help. But before I could say anything, I heard a gasp, then rapid footsteps coming towards me. I felt hands on my shoulders, heard a voice asking what happened. I couldn't make out the words properly. Everything sounded muffled, like I was underwater. But it didn't matter. Someone was here. Help had arrived. I tried to explain what had happened, the words tumbling out in a confused jumble. The pudding, the explosion, the tree. I couldn't tell if I was making any sense. The hands were guiding me up now, carefully helping me to my feet. I could feel glass crunching under my shoes. As they led me away from the mess in the living room, I felt a rush of dizziness. The adrenaline that had been keeping me going was starting to wear off, leaving me shaky and weak. My face and eyes were still burning, the pain a constant throbbing presence. I heard water running. We must have made it to the bathroom. Gentle hands were guiding my face towards the sink. The cool water was a shock against my skin, but as it ran over my closed eyes, I felt a moment of relief. It stung, but it was washing away whatever was stuck to my eyelids. After what felt like ages of rinsing, I finally felt like I could try to open my eyes. It was hard. They felt swollen and sore, but slowly I managed to crack them open. Everything was blurry at first, just vague shapes and colors, but as I blinked, things started to come into focus. I could see. The relief was so intense I felt my knees go weak. I gripped the edges of the sink, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My face was red and blotchy, streaked with what looked like a mix of blood and pudding. My eyes were bloodshot and puffy, but I could see. I was in the kitchen getting ready to make Christmas dinner for my family. We do this big gathering every year, and it was my turn to host. The counters were covered with ingredients, a huge turkey, potatoes, vegetables, you name it. I had my mom's old recipe card spread out, trying to make sure I didn't forget anything. The kitchen was warm from the oven preheating, and I could hear my family chatting in the living room. Kids were running around, probably hyped up on Christmas cookies. I was feeling pretty good, excited to cook this big meal for everyone. I started prepping the turkey, getting it ready for the oven. That's when I realized I needed to grease the roasting pan. I reached into the cabinet under the sink where I keep all my cooking oils and cleaning supplies. It was pretty cluttered in there and I had to dig around a bit. I grabbed what I thought was the vegetable oil bottle. It was about the right size and shape, and I didn't really look at it closely. I was in a hurry, you know? I just wanted to get the turkey in the oven so I could move on to the other dishes. I poured a good amount of the liquid into the roasting pan and spread it around with a paper towel. That's when I noticed the smell. It was sharp and chemical, not at all like the mild scent of vegetable oil. I figured maybe the bottle had picked up some odors from being stored near cleaning supplies. I shrugged it off and put the turkey in the pan, then slid it into the oven. As I closed the oven door, that weird smell got stronger. It was kind of burning my nose a little, but I tried to ignore it. I had so much other stuff to do, I didn't want to get sidetracked. As I started working on the side dishes, the smell kept getting worse. It was this acrid chemical odor that was starting to fill the whole kitchen. My eyes were watering a bit, and my throat felt scratchy. I opened a window thinking maybe some fresh air would help. That's when my aunt came into the kitchen asking what that smell was. She was coughing a little and rubbing her eyes. I told her I wasn't sure. Maybe something was burning in the oven. But when I opened the oven door to check, this cloud of fumes came out that made both of us start coughing hard. I quickly turned off the oven and pulled out the turkey. The smell coming from the roasting pan was overwhelming. It didn't smell like food at all. It was more like when you use a really strong cleaning product. That's when it hit me. I rushed to the cabinet and pulled out the bottle I'd used. It wasn't vegetable oil, it was carpet cleaner. The bottles were similar in size and shape, and I'd grabbed the wrong one without looking. I felt sick to my stomach as I realized what I'd done. I'd essentially been cooking the turkey in chemicals and filling the house with toxic fumes. I ran to the living room to tell everyone we needed to open all the windows and get out of the house. But as soon as I got there, I could see something was wrong. My uncle was slumped in his chair, looking pale and disoriented. My cousin was throwing up in a trash can. The kids were crying, complaining that their eyes and throats hurt. Everything became chaotic really fast. Someone opened all the windows, while someone else called 911. We started getting everyone outside into the fresh air. I was trying to explain to people what had happened, but I was coughing so much it was hard to talk. My grandmother, who has breathing problems anyway, was having a really hard time. She couldn't stop coughing, and her breathing sounded wheezy and labored. My uncle, the one who had been slumped in the chair, wasn't much better. He seemed confused and was having trouble walking straight. The ambulance arrived pretty quickly. The paramedics took one look at my grandmother and uncle and said they needed to go to the hospital right away. They were worried about chemical inhalation and wanted to get them on oxygen. As they were loading my grandmother and uncle into the ambulance, I couldn't stop apologizing. I felt terrible. This was all my fault. Christmas was ruined, and worse, I'd put my whole family in danger. The paramedics asked me what exactly they had inhaled, so I ran back into the house to grab the carpet cleaner bottle. The fumes were still strong inside, and just being in there for a minute made my eyes burn and my chest feel tight. I grabbed the bottle and hurried back out, handing it to one of the paramedics. He looked at it and shook his head, saying this was serious stuff to be breathing in. They decided that anyone who had been in the house needed to go to the ER to get checked out, just to be safe. So we all piled into cars to follow the ambulance. The whole way there, I could hear people coughing and complaining about headaches. When we got to the ER, it was packed. Apparently, we weren't the only family with a Christmas disaster, but as soon as the staff heard about the chemical inhalation, they rushed my grandmother and uncle back immediately. The rest of us had to wait, which was agonizing. We sat in the waiting room for what felt like forever. Everyone was still coughing and a few people had thrown up. The kids were scared and cranky. I kept trying to apologize, but people were too focused on feeling awful to really respond. Finally, a doctor came out to talk to us. He said my grandmother and uncle were being treated for chemical pneumonitis, basically inflammation in their lungs from breathing in the fumes. They were going to have to stay in the hospital for a while. The doctor wanted to examine everyone else too, especially the kids and anyone who had been in the kitchen. He explained that even if we were feeling okay now, there could be delayed reactions to the chemical exposure. One by one, we were taken back to be checked out. They did lung function tests and checked our oxygen levels. Some people were given breathing treatments to help clear their lungs. Others were put on IV fluids because the vomiting had dehydrated them. I was one of the last to be seen. By that point, my throat felt like it was on fire, and I had this constant tickle in my chest that made me want to cough. The doctor listened to my lungs and frowned, saying he heard some wheezing. He explained that because I had been right there in the kitchen when the fumes were strongest, I had probably gotten a pretty high dose of the chemicals. He wanted to admit me overnight for observation and to do some more tests. As I sat there on the exam table, listening to the doctor talk about possible lung damage and long-term effects, it really hit me how badly I had messed up. What was supposed to be a nice family Christmas had turned into a medical emergency, all because I hadn't taken a few seconds to look closely at a bottle. We were all gathered in the living room getting ready for our annual Christmas toast. The tree lights were twinkling and everyone was in high spirits. I volunteered to open the champagne, thinking it'd be a nice gesture. I mean, how hard could it be, right? I went to the kitchen to grab the bottle from the fridge. It was one of those fancy ones with gold foil all over it. As I picked it up, I noticed it was pretty cold, and the glass felt slippery in my hands. I brought it back to the living room where everyone was waiting. My dad was sitting in his favorite armchair, right across from where I was standing. He's in his 70s, and he was wearing this red Christmas sweater my mom had given him. I remember thinking how happy he looked surrounded by the family. I started to unwrap the foil from the top of the bottle. It was tougher than I expected, and my fingers were fumbling a bit. I could feel everyone watching me, which made me a little nervous. I finally got the foil off and started working on the wire cage around the cork. That's when things started to feel off. The wire was really tight, and I was having trouble loosening it. I twisted and turned, but it wouldn't budge. I didn't want to look like I couldn't handle it, so I kept at it, probably using more force than I should have. Suddenly, the wire came loose all at once. The bottle shifted in my hands, and I felt the cork start to move. Before I could react, there was this loud pop, way louder than I expected. It sounded more like a gunshot than a champagne cork. Everything seemed to slow down for a second. I saw the cork fly out of the bottle at an incredible speed. It was like a bullet shooting straight across the room, and then, in what felt like slow motion, I watched it hit my dad right in the eye. The impact was shocking. 1 second, my dad was smiling, and the next, his head snapped back. He let out this awful yell of pain that I'll never forget. His hands flew up to his face and he doubled over in his chair. For a moment, everyone was frozen. Then chaos erupted. People started shouting and rushing towards my dad. I just stood there, still holding the bottle, champagne foam spilling over my hands. I couldn't believe what had just happened. My mom was the first to reach him. She was trying to get him to move his hands so she could see his eye, but he was in too much pain. When he finally lowered his hands, I caught a glimpse of his face and my stomach dropped. His eye was already swelling shut and there was blood. Someone was shouting to call an ambulance, but my brother said it would be faster if we drove ourselves. Everything was happening so fast. My sister ran to get ice while my brother and I helped my dad to his feet. He was disoriented and kept saying he couldn't see out of his right eye. We managed to get him to the car with my mom supporting one side and me on the other. The drive to the hospital was tense. Every bump in the road made my dad groan in pain. My mom kept talking to him, trying to keep him calm, but I could hear the panic in her voice. The emergency room was busy, even on Christmas. As soon as we walked in, a nurse took one look at my dad and rushed him to a room. The rest of us had to wait outside. I kept replaying the moment in my head, wondering if I could have done something differently. After what felt like hours, a doctor came out to talk to us. He explained that the cork had caused significant damage to my dad's eye. There was bleeding inside the eye, and the impact had partially detached his retina. They needed to operate immediately to try to save his vision. They whisked my dad away for emergency surgery. The waiting room was decorated for Christmas with a small tree in the corner and tinsel along the walls. It felt surreal to be sitting there, surrounded by holiday cheer, while my dad was in surgery because of what I'd done. As we waited, more family members started arriving at the hospital. They had all left the house right after us. Everyone was asking what happened, and I had to explain it over and over. Each time I felt worse. The surgery took longer than expected. We sat there for hours, barely speaking, just waiting for news. I couldn't stop thinking about how quickly everything had changed. One minute we were about to celebrate, and the next, we were facing the possibility that my dad might lose his eye. Finally, the surgeon came out to talk to us. He looked tired but not grim, which gave me a glimmer of hope. He explained that they had managed to repair some of the damage, but it was too soon to know if my dad would regain full vision in that eye. He would need to stay in the hospital for a few days for observation and further treatment. They let us see my dad briefly in the recovery room. He was groggy from the anesthesia, with a large bandage covering his right eye. Seeing him like that, knowing I was responsible, was one of the worst moments of my life. The festive Christmas sweater he was still wearing seemed to mock the whole situation. As we left the hospital that night, I realized Christmas would never be the same for our family. What should have been a day of celebration had turned into a nightmare, all because of a champagne cork. The weight of what had happened, and how close we'd come to an even worse outcome, was overwhelming. We were all set for our annual Christmas movie marathon. The living room was decked out with twinkling lights and garlands, and the tree in the corner was giving off that fresh pine scent. I'd just finished hanging the last of the stockings when my mom called out that the popcorn was ready. I grabbed the biggest bowl we had and filled it to the brim with hot, buttery popcorn. The smell was incredible, and I couldn't wait to dig in. As I carried it back to the living room, I could hear the opening credits of our first movie starting up. Everyone was getting comfortable. My dad was in his usual spot, the recliner by the window. My mom and sister were on the couch, already wrapped up in blankets. My brother was sprawled out on the floor, surrounded by pillows. I set the popcorn down on the coffee table and squeezed in between my mom and sister. As the movie played, we all reached for handfuls of popcorn. I was barely paying attention to how much I was eating, just mechanically shoving it into my mouth as I watched the screen. The warmth of the room, the comfort of being with family, and the familiar scenes of the movie we'd seen a dozen times before. It all felt so normal, so safe. About halfway through the movie, I grabbed another handful of popcorn. As I tossed it into my mouth, I felt something different. A kernel got stuck in my throat. At first, I didn't think much of it. I'd had popcorn get stuck before, and usually a quick sip of water or a hard swallow would fix it. I reached for my drink, but as I tried to swallow, I realized this was different. The kernel wasn't budging. I could feel it lodged in my throat, and each attempt to swallow only seemed to make it worse. I sat up straighter, trying to focus on breathing normally, but there was a tightness in my chest that wasn't there before. I coughed, thinking that might dislodge it. Nothing happened. I coughed again, harder this time. My sister glanced over at me but quickly looked back at the movie. I could feel a slight panic starting to build. I coughed again, and this time it was more of a wheeze. My mom turned to me and asked if I was okay. I tried to answer, but no words came out, just another wheezing cough. That's when I realized I couldn't breathe properly. Each attempt to inhale was met with resistance, like trying to suck air through a straw that's too narrow. I stood up quickly, knocking the bowl of popcorn off the table. Kernels scattered across the floor, but I barely noticed. I was too focused on trying to breathe. My hands went to my throat instinctively, and I could feel my eyes widening as the panic really set in. My family was all looking at me now. I could see the confusion on their faces turning to concern. My dad asked what was wrong, but I couldn't answer. I just pointed at my throat, desperately trying to convey what was happening. For a moment, they all just stared. I think they thought I was playing some kind of joke. My brother even laughed, telling me to knock it off. But as I continued to struggle, making awful gasping noises, their expressions changed. The reality of the situation hit them all at once. My mom jumped up, asking if I was choking. I nodded frantically. She rushed over and started patting my back, hard. It didn't help. If anything, it made me more aware of how little air I was getting. Black spots were starting to dance at the edges of my vision. My dad was on his feet now too, looking panicked. He suggested I try to drink some water, but I couldn't even consider swallowing anything. My sister was frozen on the couch, her face pale with shock. The Christmas movie was still playing in the background, the cheerful music a bizarre contrast to the scene unfolding in front of it. I could feel myself getting weaker. My legs were shaky, and I had to lean on the coffee table to stay upright. The pressure in my chest was intense, like someone was sitting on me. Each attempt to breathe was more desperate than the last. That's when my brother sprang into action. He'd been in the military and had some medical training. He rushed over to me, positioning himself behind me. I felt his arms wrap around my waist, and I knew he was about to perform the Heimlich maneuver. The first thrust was shocking. I felt like all the air was being forced out of me, but the colonel didn't move. My brother adjusted his position and tried again. This time, the force of it lifted me slightly off my feet. Still, nothing. I could hear my family's voices, sounding distant and muffled. My mom was crying. My dad was saying something about calling an ambulance. My vision was getting darker, and I felt like I was about to pass out. My brother gave one more tremendous thrust. This time, I felt something shift. There was a moment of searing pain in my throat, and then suddenly, miraculously, I could breathe. The kernel shot out of my mouth, bouncing off the TV screen and landing somewhere on the floor. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. Each breath was painful, but it was the most relief I'd ever felt. I was vaguely aware of my family crowding around me, asking if I was okay, telling me to take deep breaths. My throat felt raw, and I could taste blood. As the initial panic subsided, I became aware of other sensations. My ribs ached where my brother had squeezed me. I felt bruised and battered, like I'd been in a fight. My shirt was damp with sweat, and I was shaking uncontrollably. The whole incident had probably only lasted a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity. As I sat there on the floor, surrounded by scattered popcorn and my terrified family, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The cheerful Christmas decorations seemed to mock the scene. The movie was still playing, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded. I looked up at my brother, who was standing over me, his face a mix of relief and lingering fear. I wanted to thank him, to tell him he'd saved my life, but my throat hurt too much to speak. Instead, I just nodded at him, hoping he understood. My mom was kneeling beside me, her hand on my back, asking if I needed anything. My dad was on the phone, presumably with emergency services. My sister had disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with a glass of water. I took a small sip, wincing as it went down. The cool water provided some relief to my raw throat, but swallowing was still painful. I could feel the beginnings of what I knew would be some serious bruising around my ribs and abdomen. As I sat there trying to regain my composure, I couldn't help but think about how quickly everything had changed. One minute, we were having a normal, pleasant family Christmas, and the next, I was fighting for my life. All because of a single popcorn kernel. The sound of sirens in the distance brought me back to the present. My dad was at the window looking out for the ambulance. My mom was still beside me, her hand on my arm, as if afraid to let go. My brother had stepped back, but I could see him watching me closely, ready to jump in again if needed. I tried to stand up, but my legs felt weak and shaky. My brother and mom helped me to the couch where I sat, still taking careful, measured breaths. Each inhale reminded me of how close I'd come to not being able to breathe at all. The kitchen was a mess on Christmas Eve. Flour dusted the countertops and measuring cups were scattered everywhere. I decided to try making homemade eggnog this year. My family always bought it from the store, but I wanted to do something special, you know? Make it from scratch like my grandmother used to. I'd found this recipe online that looked pretty straightforward. Milk, cream, eggs, sugar, nutmeg, the usual stuff. I started gathering all the ingredients, pulling them out of the fridge and cupboards. The house was quiet. Everyone else was out doing last-minute Christmas shopping or wrapping presents. As I was measuring out the milk, I noticed the carton felt a bit bloated. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was in a hurry trying to get the eggnog made before everyone got back. I poured it into the mixing bowl and yeah, it smelled a little off, but I figured that was just because I wasn't used to the raw milk smell. I'd never made eggnog before, so what did I know? I whisked everything together, added the spices, and gave it a taste. It was different. Not quite what I expected, but I thought maybe that's just how homemade eggnog was supposed to taste. It had a bit of a tang to it, but I assumed that was from the alcohol I'd added. I poured the mixture into a big glass pitcher and stuck it in the fridge to chill. Later that evening, everyone was gathered in the living room. The Christmas tree lights were twinkling, and there was wrapping paper everywhere from the few presents we were allowed to open on Christmas Eve. I brought out the eggnog, feeling pretty proud of myself. I poured glasses for everyone, and we all raised a toast to the holidays. I took a big gulp of mine. It still tasted a bit odd, but I didn't want to admit that my homemade eggnog wasn't great. Everyone else seemed to be drinking theirs too, so I figured it must be fine. We spent the rest of the evening watching Christmas movies and snacking on cookies. I had another glass of eggnog, and so did most of the family. It was late when we all headed to bed. I remember feeling a little queasy as I brushed my teeth, but I chalked it up to too many cookies and the rich eggnog. I fell asleep quickly, excited for Christmas morning. I woke up in the middle of the night with my stomach churning. At first I tried to ignore it, but then came this sudden, urgent need to get to the bathroom. I barely made it in time. As I sat there, my insides feeling like they were trying to escape, I heard a commotion in the hallway. The door to my parents' room flew open, and I could hear my dad rushing to the other bathroom. That's when I started to realize something was very, very wrong. I could hear retching sounds coming from my sister's room. My mom was knocking on the bathroom door, begging my dad to hurry up because she needed to get in there too. I finally managed to leave the bathroom, my legs shaky and my stomach still doing flips. In the hallway, I saw my brother sitting on the floor, looking pale and clutching a trash can. The smell in the house was awful, a mix of vomit and something else I couldn't quite place. We spent the rest of the night taking turns in the bathroom. At one point, I was so desperate I had to use a bucket in my room because both bathrooms were occupied. The sounds and smells were horrific. Every few minutes, someone would groan or make a mad dash for the toilet. When morning finally came, none of us were in any shape to celebrate Christmas. The living room, which had looked so festive the night before, now seemed to mock us. The presents sat untouched under the tree. The stockings hung limply, stuffed with treats none of us could even think about eating. My mom, looking pale and shaky, suggested we try to open some presents. We all shuffled into the living room, clutching our stomachs and bringing along buckets or trash cans just in case. The smell of the Christmas tree, which usually filled me with joy, now made me feel nauseous. As we sat there trying to muster some enthusiasm for the gifts, my dad suddenly asked what could have made us all so sick. That's when it hit me. The eggnog. I remembered the bloated milk carton, the odd smell, the strange taste. My stomach dropped, and not just from the nausea. I confessed about the homemade eggnog, about how the milk had seemed a little off, but I'd used it anyway. My family's faces went from confusion to realization to something between anger and despair. Here we were on Christmas morning, all violently ill because I hadn't checked if the milk was spoiled. The rest of the day was a blur of misery. We tried to eat some dry toast, but most of us couldn't keep it down. The kitchen, still a mess from my eggnog making the day before, remained untouched. None of us had the energy to clean it up, and the sight and smell of food was too much to bear. Our traditional Christmas dinner sat in the fridge, uneaten. The turkey, which my mom had spent hours preparing the day before, went uncooked. The vegetables wilted, and the desserts remained uncut. Instead of the usual festive feast, our Christmas meal consisted of sips of water and nibbles of saltine crackers. As the day wore on, we tried to make the best of it. Someone put on a Christmas movie, but the cheerful scenes only highlighted how miserable we all felt. We dozed on and off on the couches, taking turns rushing to the bathroom. The sound of retching became as common as jingle bells on a normal Christmas. By evening, the worst of it seemed to be over, but we were all exhausted and weak. The house was a mess. Used tissues everywhere, half-empty glasses of water on every surface, and an overwhelming smell that no amount of air freshener could mask. Looking around at my family, my dad slumped in his armchair, my mom curled up on the couch, my siblings sprawled on the floor. I felt terrible. This was supposed to be a day of joy and celebration, and instead I turned it into a nightmare of food poisoning and misery. As night fell, we all retreated to our rooms, too tired and sick to even say goodnight properly. The Christmas lights outside twinkled mockingly through my window. I could hear someone in the bathroom again, and my own stomach was still doing somersaults. I lay in bed, unable to sleep, replaying the events in my mind, the excitement of trying to make homemade eggnog, the pride I'd felt serving it to my family, and then the horrific realization of what I'd done. All because I hadn't taken a moment to really check if the milk was good. The house creaked and settled, but instead of the usual cozy Christmas night sounds, all I could hear were the groans of my family members and the occasional rush to the bathroom. The festive atmosphere had been completely shattered, replaced by an air of illness and disappointment. As I drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, I couldn't help but think about all the Christmas traditions we'd missed out on. No leisurely morning of opening presents and exclaiming over gifts. No big family breakfast with pancakes and bacon. No afternoon walk to look at the neighborhood decorations. No Christmas dinner with all the trimmings. No pulling crackers or wearing paper crowns. No fighting over the last piece of pie. The kitchen was a whirlwind of activity on Christmas Day. I'd been up since dawn, prepping the turkey and all the fixings. The house was filled with the rich aroma of roasting meat and herbs. My family was scattered throughout the house, wrapping last-minute gifts or watching the parade on TV. I'd just opened the oven door to check on the turkey. The blast of hot air hit my face and I could see the golden brown skin glistening with juices. It looked perfect. I grabbed the oven mitts and carefully lifted the heavy roasting pan. The weight of it surprised me, even though I'd done this many times before. As I turned to carry the turkey to the dining room, I noticed our new puppy had wandered into the kitchen. He was weaving between my legs, tail wagging, probably drawn by the delicious smells. I tried to step around him, but he was so small and quick, darting this way and that. I took a step, then another, trying to keep my balance while holding the heavy pan. The puppy suddenly darted right in front of me. I felt my foot catch on something, probably his tail or paw. In that split second, I knew I was going down. The world seemed to slow down. I could feel myself falling forward, the weight of the turkey pulling me down faster than I could react. The roasting pan tilted in my hands, and I watched in horror as the scalding hot grease began to spill over the edge. I hit the floor hard, my knees and elbows taking the brunt of the impact. But that pain was nothing compared to what came next. The boiling hot grease poured over my arms and chest. It felt like liquid fire spreading across my skin. For a moment, I couldn't even breathe. The pain was so intense, so all-encompassing that it seemed to short-circuit everything else. Then I heard myself scream. It was a sound I'd never made before, raw and primal. I tried to push myself up to get away from the heat, but my arms gave out. Every movement sent new waves of agony through my body. The grease had soaked through my shirt, and I could feel it burning into my skin. The kitchen erupted into chaos. I could hear people running, shouting, but it all seemed distant and muffled compared to the roaring in my ears. Someone was trying to help me up, but their touch on my burned skin only intensified the pain. I managed to roll onto my back, away from the spilled grease. The cool tile of the kitchen floor provided a brief moment of relief, but it wasn't nearly enough. My skin felt like it was still on fire, the burning sensation growing more intense with each passing second. Through the haze of pain, I could see my family's faces hovering over me. Their expressions were a mix of shock and panic. Someone was saying we needed to call an ambulance. I wanted to agree, to tell them to hurry, but I couldn't form the words. All I could do was lie there, every breath sending new shock waves of pain through my body. I heard someone on the phone, their voice shaky as they described what had happened. The words severe burns and emergency cut through the fog in my mind. I tried to focus on something, anything other than the pain, but it was impossible. Every nerve ending felt like it was exploding. Someone mentioned running cold water over the burns, and I felt myself being lifted. The movement was excruciating. Even the slightest touch on my burned skin felt like sandpaper being dragged across raw flesh. They managed to get me to the sink, and as the cold water hit my arms, I gasped. The initial shock was painful, but after a few moments, it provided a small measure of relief. I don't know how long I stood there, hunched over the sink, letting the water run over my burns. Time seemed to lose all meaning. I was vaguely aware of people moving around me, of hushed conversations and the sound of more running water. Someone had filled a large bowl with cold water and was using it to soak towels, which they then draped gently over the parts of me that couldn't fit under the faucet. The wet towels helped, but the relief was temporary. As soon as the fabric started to warm up, the burning sensation would return full force. It was a constant cycle of momentary relief followed by renewed agony. I heard sirens in the distance growing louder. A wave of relief washed over me. Help was coming. But with that relief came a new fear. How bad were the burns? Would there be permanent damage? The thoughts raced through my mind, competing with the pain for my attention. The paramedics arrived in what seemed like both an eternity and no time at all. They entered the kitchen, their voices calm and professional amidst the chaos. I felt someone gently moving the wet towels, heard sharp intakes of breath as they assessed the burns. They started asking questions about allergies, medications, how long ago the burns had occurred. I tried to answer, but forming coherent sentences was a struggle. Every word felt like it required immense effort. I felt something cool being applied to my burns, some kind of gel or cream. It stung at first, but then began to numb the area slightly. Not enough to eliminate the pain, but enough to make it somewhat bearable. They explained they needed to move me to the ambulance. The thought of being moved, of anything touching my burned skin, sent a fresh wave of panic through me. But I knew it was necessary. I gritted my teeth as they helped me onto the stretcher. The movement from the kitchen to the ambulance was a blur of pain and disorientation. Every bump, every slight jostle sent new shockwaves of agony through my body. The cold winter air hit my burns as we went outside, adding a new dimension to the pain. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I caught one last glimpse of my house. The Christmas lights were still twinkling, oblivious to the disaster that had unfolded inside. The contrast between the festive exterior and the chaos I'd just experienced was jarring. The doors of the ambulance closed, shutting out the sight of my home and family. The siren started up, loud and urgent. As we began to move, I closed my eyes, trying to breathe through the pain. The paramedic was saying something about pain medication, but his voice seemed far away. I felt a sharp prick in my arm, an IV being inserted, then a cool sensation spreading through my veins. The pain began to dull slightly, becoming more of a throbbing ache than the searing agony it had been, but it was still there, a constant reminder of how quickly a normal day could turn into a nightmare. As the ambulance sped towards the hospital, I found myself replaying the moment of the fall over and over in my mind. The weight of the turkey, the puppy underfoot, the feeling of losing my balance. It had all happened so fast, yet somehow in slow motion at the same time. The medication was making me feel slightly disconnected, but I could still hear the paramedics talking, discussing burn percentages and treatment plans. Their words floated around me, some registering, others slipping away before I could grasp their meaning. I felt the ambulance make a sharp turn, then begin to slow down. We must be arriving at the hospital. The doors opened, letting in a rush of cold air. More hands were there, helping to unload the stretcher. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through my body, cutting through the haze of the medication. As they wheeled me into the emergency room, the bright fluorescent lights overhead seemed harsh and unforgiving. They illuminated everything in stark detail. The concerned faces of the medical staff, the clinical whiteness of the walls, the flurry of activity all around. I could hear someone rattling off information about my condition. Male, mid-30s, severe burns to arms and chest from hot grease. It sounded surreal, like they were talking about someone else. But the pain, even dulled by medication, was a constant reminder that this was very much happening to me. They moved me from the ambulance stretcher to a hospital bed. Even with their careful movements, the transfer was agonizing. Every touch, every shift in position sent new shockwaves of pain through my burned skin. A doctor appeared, her face serious as she began to examine the burns. I could see the concern in her eyes as she gently probed the damaged areas. She was asking questions, but I was struggling to focus, to form coherent answers. The pain, the medication, the shock of it all, it was overwhelming. Nurses were moving around me, attaching monitors, adjusting IVs. I heard mentions of fluids, pain management, burn units. The reality of the situation was starting to sink in. This wasn't going to be a quick fix. This was serious. We were all at my aunt's house for Christmas dinner. It's kind of a tradition in our family. Every year we gather at her place for the holidays. She's always been proud of her cooking, especially this casserole she makes. It's been a staple at our family gatherings for as long as I can remember. The house was packed when we arrived. Kids were running around, adults were chatting, and the smell of food filled every room. My aunt was in the kitchen, putting the finishing touches on everything. I could see steam rising from the various dishes on the counter. We all gathered around the big dining table. It was covered with a red and green tablecloth, and there were candles and little Christmas decorations scattered between the plates. The casserole was right in the center, looking all golden and bubbly. Everyone was passing dishes around, filling their plates. I was pretty hungry, so I took a good portion of everything, including a big scoop of the famous casserole. It looked delicious with its crispy top and chunks of vegetables and meat peeking through. I started eating, trying a bit of everything. The turkey was good, the potatoes were creamy, but I was really looking forward to the casserole. I'd been thinking about it for days, to be honest. It's one of those comfort foods that just tastes like the holidays. So I took a big forkful of the casserole and put it in my mouth. At first it tasted just like I remembered, savory with a mix of flavors that blended really well together. But then, as I was chewing, I felt something odd. There was a texture that didn't belong. It was kind of furry. That's the only way I can describe it. It wasn't like anything I'd ever felt in my mouth before. It didn't taste right either. There was this weird, gamey flavor that definitely wasn't part of the recipe. I tried to figure out what it could be while I was still chewing. Maybe a piece of herb that hadn't been chopped properly. But no, it was too substantial for that. It felt like a chunk of something solid. I couldn't swallow it. My body was telling me that whatever this was, it wasn't food. So I did the only thing I could think of. I reached into my mouth to pull it out. I know it's not exactly table manners, but at that moment I didn't care. As I pulled this thing out of my mouth, I could feel everyone's eyes on me. I guess it's not every day someone starts fishing around in their mouth during Christmas dinner. But I wasn't thinking about that. I was focused on this object. When I finally got it out and looked at it, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing at first. It was small, maybe the size of my thumb. It was partially covered in the sauce from the casserole, but I could see fur, And then I saw a tiny paw. It hit me all at once. I was holding a partially cooked mouse, a mouse that had been in my mouth, a mouse that I had been chewing on. The realization made my stomach lurch. I dropped it on my plate, and it landed with a wet plop. There was a moment of silence as everyone at the table seemed to realize what had happened at the same time. And then chaos broke out. My aunt started apologizing profusely. Someone else was asking how this could have happened. The kids were a mix of grossed out and fascinated. But I couldn't focus on any of that. All I could think about was the fact that I had just had a dead mouse in my mouth. The nausea hit me hard and fast. I could feel the bile rising in my throat. I tried to stand up, thinking I could make it to the bathroom, but my legs felt weak. The room started to spin a little. I opened my mouth to say something, to excuse myself maybe, but instead I threw up. Right there at the table, all over my plate, the tablecloth, probably even on the person sitting next to me. I couldn't stop it. The sounds of disgust and concern for my family seemed far away. All I could focus on was the horrible taste in my mouth and the sight of my partially digested dinner, mouse included, on the table in front of me. Someone handed me a napkin, and I wiped my mouth. My aunt was still apologizing, saying she had no idea how this could have happened. Someone else was theorizing that the mouse must have fallen into the casserole dish while it was cooling in the garage. I stood up, my legs shaky. I needed to get away from the table, away from the smell of vomit and the sight of that mouse. I stumbled to the bathroom, splashed some water on my face, and rinsed my mouth out about a dozen times. But I could still taste it, that weird, gamey flavor that I now knew was mouse. When I came back out, the dining room was in disarray. Half the family was still at the table examining the casserole dish. The other half was in the kitchen, either helping to clean up or just getting away from the scene. The kids had been shooed away to another room. My aunt was in tears, still trying to explain and apologize. Someone had put the mouse in a plastic bag and was examining it closely, as if trying to figure out how long it had been in the casserole. Others were checking their own plates, probably wondering if they had eaten any mouse too. The mood had completely shifted. What was supposed to be a joyful family dinner had turned into this bizarre, disgusting scenario. The Christmas music playing in the background felt completely out of place now. People were starting to leave. Some were saying they felt sick too, whether from actually eating the contaminated food or just from the idea of it. Others were trying to salvage the holiday spirit, suggesting we order pizza or Chinese food instead. But for me, the damage was done. I couldn't get the image of that little mouse paw out of my head. The taste in my mouth, even after rinsing repeatedly, was making me gag. I knew I wouldn't be able to eat anything else that night. As I sat on the couch, trying to sip some water to settle my stomach, I could hear my family members in the kitchen. They were throwing out all the food, not wanting to risk any more contamination. The sound of dishes clattering and garbage bags rustling was punctuated by exclamations of disgust and disbelief. My aunt came over to apologize again. She was mortified, kept saying how she always kept a clean kitchen, and she had no idea how this could have happened. I tried to reassure her, but honestly, I was still in shock. Part of me wanted to comfort her, but another part just wanted to go home and brush my teeth about 100 times. The house, which had been so warm and inviting when we arrived, now felt tainted somehow. The Christmas tree lights seemed too bright, the holiday decorations almost mocking. What should have been a day of celebration had turned into this surreal nightmare. People were starting to leave. There were awkward goodbyes, with everyone trying to find the right thing to say. How do you end a Christmas gathering that's been ruined by a mouse in the casserole? There's no greeting card for that. Hey there again. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel. This will really help the channel to grow, and you can be notified of the new videos. And I have something more for you. I chose another video for you to watch. Just click the card here to go to the video. Hope you like it. See you there.